There we go. Okay, so technology problems somewhat handled. We're just going to go forward with the conversation, and it's going to be shared with the community at a later time. So I apologize if people are like, here's watching it, like, there's this easy, simple solution on Zoom. How do you not know that? Feel free to email me. Feel free to tutor me. Okay, so thank you for your intro and sharing about kind of what your experience, because again, we talked about this before we came on, but I found your book just really helpful as someone who's trying to parse out her own thoughts and feelings on the issue of abortion. It was just really helpful to me because of the nuances that you brought out. And so I think, again, we've talked about before, like a lot of people who are probably watching this and are part of our community, I grew up in a very specific community that had very set views on abortion, and I didn't even know that you could love Jesus and think any differently. And it wasn't a malicious, it was a wonderful community, but I sometimes feel like Paul when I talk about it, I'm like, here are my evangelical pro-life bona fides. Here are the things. I grew up in the 90s. I mean, in an evangelical church. So just thinking about how to unpack that and how to very much undo, certain kinds of teaching, not because they necessarily were wrong, because I think faithful minds can differ, but almost the behind that, which is what you're so helpful with, is the why. Why do we believe this? What is this based on? And so thinking about the way you talked about biblical history and the biblical foundations that, again, come in my background, and again, I'm sure a lot of people, can you talk a little bit about, as you researched and did that stuff for your book, and I'm sure obviously before that, what was surprising to you, and what do you kind of wish that people maybe knew more of or explored more of?
So I think one of the things I had become aware of was, the Catholic Church actually changed its view about the fetus in 1869, right? Like, so before 1869, they believed in something called quickening. Quickening was when the mother felt the baby kick. And that was believed to be the moment of ensoulment, because up until that point, there was no motion, so there wasn't evidence of life, at least from what people could tell. And part of what was happening was the Catholic Church was learning from science, and so they were like, we need to revisit that. And so they, in 1869, they moved it back to the moment of conception, but they used a moral probability argument. And it was not something that they would say they knew for certain. And so both of those things are so important. Like, well, why did they believe this thing before? And then what are the limits of what they believed after? And so, I really wish that people actually looked at Exodus 21 verses 22 to 25, because that's the single most important scripture related to the moral value of the fetus. I mean, you have other scriptures like God knew me in my mother's womb and stuff, but it's not enough. It doesn't tell us, well, what does that mean? What's the significance of that? And then how do you make moral and ethical choices when you have to, choose, for example, life of the mother, life of the fetus, or other things? So, because moral choices are things that we do when there are competing moral values. If there's only one moral value, then life is easy. But how much of life really is that? So Exodus 21 is really important. Should I briefly go into that?
Yes, that would be really helpful, because again, I think it's not something that you learn a lot about when you're looking at it from a certain angle. So I think it's really helpful to parse out that nuance.
Sure. So Exodus 21 is the situation where, or there's a collection of laws that have to do with bodily harm, which makes a lot of sense, because this is the first stuff that God says to Israel after he brings them out of Egypt, really, where they endured a lot of bodily harm. And so there are limits placed on that. And so there's one situation in verse 22 and onwards where people are in a fight and a pregnant woman is struck, and then something happens. And the weird thing is that we don't actually know. I mean, there are two manuscripts, the Hebrew Masoretic, although there are other manuscripts before that that were in Hebrew, like the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Samaritan Pentateuch. And then there's the Greek translation of that, which is called the Septuagint translation, originated from Alexandria, Egypt. And they don't agree about what you should do. So the Hebrew Masoretic says, well, birth and breath equals full legal personhood. And so that's why the fetus is not to be considered as a full person. There's a fine for harming or causing a forced miscarriage because the mother's struck, right? And so if the mother is harmed, then there's no question. There's this eye for eye, and that phrasing of the lex talionis, or that phrase is there. That indicates full personhood. In the Greek Septuagint, there seems to be it's more morally discerning, and so the answer is you look at the stage of the fetus, and if it's unformed, then it's a fine, and if it's formed, presumably if it looks human, then it's an eye for an eye, life for life thing, which we could get into that, like what does that really mean? But essentially the two manuscripts don't agree, and it's really fascinating because we know that the Jewish community used both of these manuscripts at the same time. The Septuagint was authenticated by the Sanhedrin, right? And so in neither case, though, does it say that, or is there any indication or basis for thinking that full human personhood begins at the moment of conception? That is clear. There's an argument that was put forward by John Calvin about like why we should interpret it that way, but that was really the first. And although there was a slight strain in the Syriac tradition, but the Syriac tradition goes in a whole bunch of directions. So that's what caused a disagreement. It was a polite disagreement between the Greek East and the Latin West. Okay. And so the Catholic Church, both traditions actually say, well, this is interesting. We know that there's a difference. We know that we should take this seriously because we take infanticide seriously. So we have to take abortion seriously too. That makes sense. And also the rights of women. There's a lot bound up in here. But the idea was, well, even if we knew which manuscript to go with, we should rely on science a little bit to tell us what's going on with the fetus. And so the Greek East relied on Hippocrates and Galen, mostly doctors, and then the Latin West relied on Aristotle, who was a scientific observer. He studied miscarriages, and he understood where some of that formation and not formation happened. And so it's really interesting, right? Like why this difference happened, and the fact that then the Catholic West decides, all right, it's quickening. There's a point of formation, of fetal formation at the stage of gestation that could make sense, where ensoulment happens, but it's not right away. And that passed into the Anglican Church and then the Puritans. And at the time of the US Constitution, that was the only view. So that's a little bit of the history there.
That's so helpful. And again, like, I just appreciate the way to look at it. Like, hey, this is sometimes I don't want to say raised, but you grow up in a church and there's just like, this is the view. And there's not a lot of exegeting to get to that, right? Or contextualizing in church history. So I think any of us who faithfully want to understand, what is our role as believers, and then you get into the extra thing, which I'm jumping ahead for us, but like everyone doesn't always agree on what that translates to legislatively, right? So that's also a nuance. And so I just again appreciate the conversation and the enlightenment that you provide, just to allow us, again, people can disagree and they can say, okay, I'm aware of that, and then I'm going to look into it, and I end up where I started. But to ignore things from church history and scripture, I think it's just, it's not the way to really, it's like you're going in just trying to confirm your own biases, which I'm sure I'm guilty of a lot as well. So I think that's really helpful to think about that. So again, when we were talking, there's like so many things I'm like, I want to make sure. So thinking about church history, because I know if anyone's read, like for me, one of the biggest understanding moments came when I read Jesus and John Wayne, Kristen Kobes de May. That's not the point of her book, obviously, but she unpacks a little bit of the the way abortion became sort of the issue for Christians, and that is wrapped up in civil rights and women's rights and all of these different things. So again, just reflecting on history, even just recent church history,
right.
This was not a definite, look at the SBC and what we're fine with Roe v. Wade. That's oversimplifying, but everyone wasn't in agreement. And so I think that's important to understand.
Right.
So I'm gonna transition us now, because obviously there's a big Supreme Court decision that's less than a week old that we're all kind of processing. And in one of our conversations, we talked a lot about how this issue seems to make people be even more than normal, my team versus your team, right? And between the leak and the Supreme Court decision, that just seems so exacerbated to me. Like, people like, we're going to lose, you're going to win, I'm going to win, you're going to lose. And I think as Christians, we need to be so careful to think about what the impact these things have on people's lives, and what this means morally, what this means practically, and thinking about how can we promote the flourishing of humanity, right? And so I guess as you think about maybe just that truncated time period, as you interact with people and kind of did your own considerations, do you have thoughts on the ways in which the church and Christians should and can and are be, and maybe aren't, different from the world? That was a very long question, but I think hopefully that's clear where I'm going. Like, we should be different, right? And so I guess, in what ways do you see that that's happening or not happening as the polarization around this intensifies?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the things we really need to be careful of is, first of all, I mean, there's abortion itself, and like the theology and policy around that, but then there's also the politics of it and all of the issues that kind of get dragged in as a result. And so at the very least, we need to be really, really careful. I mean, in every part of that, but it is really disturbing that from 1979, 1980, that the anti-abortion movement got basically hijacked by people who were trying to use abortion as a wedge issue to bring in, to advance the Southern strategy, right? So you look at Reagan and where he started his campaign in the South at the place of the death of civil rights worker, the assassination of civil rights workers, and he said states' rights and all these things that evoked his outreach really to Southern segregationists. Something that Nixon had begun, but Reagan really continued. And there was a lot of, of course, the welfare queen stereotype, who he never said, who's not a real person, and he never said that she's Black, but he repeatedly said she's from the South Side of Chicago, right? So what is that about? And so the issue becomes that Richard Vigueri, one of the Republican fundraisers who was Catholic, and he was a thought leader on this and a fundraiser, and won a lot of people to the Reagan coalition. He said that the way we bring people into this is by talking about abortion. And that at that point, that was really emotional, because photographers could actually photograph the fetus, right? And so it evoked emotion, of course, affection. And then when you think of abortion, it becomes the emotion of disgust. You're a baby killer, so you're disgusting. And that fit with Reagan's primary and a lot of white evangelical principle around meritocratic retributive justice, right? It's like you get what you deserve. And whether that's law enforcement or you're on your own economics, we're going to dismantle the New Deal. We're going to dismantle the social supports. We're going to increase policing, increase the war on drugs and all of that. And abortion fit into that. If and that fit into kind of Christian rhetoric at the time. It was, well, if you're faithful, stay single, get married, then you can have lots of sex without guilt, and then you can have kids. And then supposedly you'll have this great marriage, God will bless it. And, and hopefully some of that is true. But what the flip side they argued was well, if you have sex before you're ready, if you have a kid before you're ready, then you should actually be in poverty. You should experience some economic hardship, which was not how the Catholic New Deal Democrats from the 30s, who they were anti-abortion, but with a different set of priorities and a different approach to the whole issue, because they saw the abortion rate spike during the Great Depression. So of course, their conclusion is we have to be anti-poverty. We have to fight for the minimum wage, labor unions, and all these social supports. Granted, it didn't encompass enough people, but the basic idea was we want to use the federal government to improve people's economic lives, and for decades it did. Limited banks, limited the power of finance, increased wages, and so on. And so that was their approach. In the 80s, that shifted. With Reagan, that shifted because he was able to frame, Richard Vigueri and other fundraisers were able to frame abortion as the result of secularism and actually atheism and communism. Their argument was, why do people get pregnant and get abortions? Well, it's because they don't trust God. And so that's atheism, whether it's formally or informally. And who organizes the atheists? It's the communists. Oh, and look at Ronald Reagan, right? He's fighting the communists in the USSR. So we can have this huge military budget. We can shift all the social spending over to military spending and drive our country into big deficit land. And that totally fits this whole narrative. And so Jesus and John Wayne, that book by Kristen Dumais, is excellent at that. And abortion was one of the wedge issues that brought together this Reagan coalition.
Yeah, okay, that's so helpful to think about, and again, allow us to see this more nuanced understanding of something that maybe we believed everyone was always on this side, or these people over here. And I think that it's really interesting. You can read about it in different places. You bring it up in your book, and in Jesus and John Wayne and other places. I think Color of Compromise, Jim Tisby talks about it a little bit too. But the way the Catholic Church, their approach versus the evangelical approach. And I don't mean to continually bring up evangelicals as like the bogeyman. I consider myself an evangelical. But just looking at the history of white evangelicalism and the way in which they came at it, the Catholic approach, data bears that out. If you want to reduce abortions, if that is your goal, because you believe life begins at conception and because this is just a heartbreak for you and you want to do everything, then the Catholic approach works in reducing that and thinking about policies now, whether it's family medical leave or universal health care, or even things up to Head Start, right? Has shown over and over again that this is what will do it. So it is really hard to reconcile that without introducing this idea that you're talking about, this retributive justice idea, which again, I don't think comes in for everyone. Some people maybe maliciously, right? It's sort of this, it very much aligns with a lot of evangelical theology. And so to apply it to this issue isn't so crazy, except when you kind of think about the practicalities of it and what that really means of how we're viewing our fellow people, right?
Right. Especially children, because it's one thing to believe that parents should bear the consequences, right? And you're right. I mean, I consider myself an evangelical. I'm uncomfortable with the idea of like sex without consequences. Is there such a thing? So, the idea of well, what about the children? What have the children done? Do children choose their parents? Clearly not. And so why do we continue to put the consequences or make children suffer for the sins of their parents? I thought Ezekiel 16, like Ezekiel, the new covenant does away with that principle, right? And even in Israel, it was very limited. You have the Jubilee principle where God hits a reset button and the land family arrangements go back, debt gets wiped out of existence, people go back to their communities. Like it's incredible. Clearly God did not want children and grandchildren to bear the student debt of their parents and grandparents, to shift it into today's terms.
Yeah. But
we allow that. And it is very clear that evangelicals need to rethink and come down on a view that what do they think the relationship is between poverty and the abortion rate? right? Does poverty drive the abortion rate higher? Well, there's lots of data that says that. Women at the poverty line and below have 3 times the abortion rate of women who are not in poverty. Men there was a study done by the National Bureau of Economic Research that of men in the Rust Belt who had lost their jobs. They proposed to their girlfriends. They did not get married at the same rates. They did not get married. And so why is that? Well, it's because of male confidence. And am I going to be able to provide? Does it mean that they were having sex any less? Probably not, right? But so poverty is this big question. The Catholics thought abortion was driven by poverty. Evangelicals, by and large, believe that poverty ought to be the threat motivation. It's the stick motivation that kind of looms out there. So if you make a bad choice, then that's what you're going to face, poverty. And it goes along with this idea of like small government. We don't want social supports because what have you done to deserve that? Meanwhile, the federal government is giving billions of dollars to defense companies and building up white America through housing, through jobs and all these kinds of things. So it's completely hypocritical. And yet, that's one of the issues that we're really going to have to decide. Like, what do we believe about that? And so, to your earlier question of how do we not be like the world? Well, retribution versus retributive justice versus restorative justice. That has to be a major point that distinguishes Christians from the world. I mean, everyone can say people should just suffer the consequences of their own actions. That's karma. But restorative justice is people need to participate and be empowered to participate in undoing the harm that they've done to other people. So how do we do that?
Yeah, that's great. And that's a great framing of it too. And as you were saying about retributive justice, I was just thinking of how much that flows through a lot of the theological underpinnings of things that evangelicals in particular, but a lot of Protestant Christians in general support, that seem to this still student of theology, contrary to New Testament principles in particular. I think a lot of times we're hanging our hats on some proverbs, about if you're lazy, this is what happens, and fools in this, and then ignoring, because Proverbs itself is a very justice-oriented book. There is a lot in there about God's heart for justice. But anyway, just thinking about what texts we kind of hang on to. I mean, that's probably a whole other conversation, but that's why I appreciate you bringing up the Exodus text, which I think is not involved in a lot of Christian abortion conversations. There are certain texts that allow us to, fully support unfettered capitalism, and then but I think we also have to ignore a lot to do that.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
So thinking about like the meta narrative of scripture and just, okay, who is God universally without just picking some verses. So thinking about that in the abortion issue and connecting it with poverty, I guess, how do we develop a more robust theology? Like, where do we start? I think all of us have some unlearning to do because we have prejudices wherever they come from. I think that's true of everyone. So how do we do that? I mean, if you have a 1, 2, 3 plan, that would be great. But even just, where do we go?
Well, I do think, some of where I went was the early church, because it was helpful to see how they were pastorally trying to handle things. And then there's certain moments that I think that in later church history that Protestantism especially acquires, Catholic Church as well, because of colonialism. And we really need to think about the impact of that on the abortion rate or the social conditions that lead to women being more vulnerable or being in poverty and things like that. And then, maybe the last third of my book is spent using the Constitution and Roe v. Wade as a diagnostic for telling a spiritual biography of the United States. And I think we need to do that because I think we need to also have a story about the Constitution. So I'm glad to talk about any of those, Elizabeth. So I generally have a three-pronged strategy that follows the three parts of the book.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Let's do that. Because as I said, I found the organization of the book really helpful because I think you pulled out, like, I'm sure there's a lot. Well, I don't know. You cover a lot under each one. So, but there's so much to go under. But the way, so your book is organized, and we'll share the link to in the comments so that people can get that, because it really is super helpful. For a nuanced Christian view. And I just want to say, like, there's just not enough of that, I don't think, because again, to me, and maybe there are more of us out here, but I just feel like you're allowed to either be this or that. And when you try to even ask questions or have a divergent view at some point where you're not towing the party line, you're not welcome, at least into a conversation. I don't mean like I'm being shunned, but
right.
So anyway, that's why I really appreciate your book as a resource, to just consider it from a biblical Christian perspective. So anyway, so yeah, your book is laid out as, just for people, it's got, you talk about church history and scripture, and then the families and protection of women or men's roles, which I also found really fascinating. So I'd love to get into that a little bit. And then the Constitution. And so, yeah, let's start at the end there, the Constitution. And I'm interested when you said telling a story, a spiritual story, and how the Roe v. Wade decision helps us do that.
Well, I mean, I think regular attenders and members of BFJN would appreciate the story of the Constitution as a, partly a flawed document, and obviously because of slavery and its compromises, but also it just wasn't thought through that well. For example, the citizenship. What does it mean to be a citizen of the United States? Well, we don't know prior to Reconstruction and the 14th Amendment, because it says the president will be a citizen of the United States. But nowhere does it define what that is. And so is it up to the states to do that? Are women citizens, for instance? They kind of are and kind of aren't. People of color, mostly not. So, and then what about at the state level? I mean, in 1859, I think the state of Oregon entered the Union with a state constitution that said we're white only. Well, can you do that? So the 14th Amendment answers this question. Who is a citizen? Well, it's anyone with birthright citizenship, right? And so right there, that's why that is one reason Donald Trump and a lot of others who fall into this camp are against the 14th Amendment. The Federalist Society wants to eviscerate the 14th Amendment because it forces us. And I will take, roughly speaking, an originalist stance on the 14th Amendment because it argues for a strong federal government, and it forces the states then to apply all of the previous amendments, the Bill of Rights especially, to their own state constitutions and the way they treat citizens, because you're a citizen of the United States first, and then secondarily of the state in which you reside. That ordering of things and the equal treatment under the law and all that we have not really mined the depth of that. So Eric Foner, in his book, The Second Founding, does a fabulous job on the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Okay. But in any case, the Federalist Society and many, unfortunately, evangelicals want to return to the pre-Civil War Constitution. And that was especially clear during Brown v. Board in 1954. I mean, their rhetoric of these judges are unelected judges and states' rights and let's wave the flag of segregation and really the old Confederacy got kicked up. All of that rhetoric got transferred into the abortion debate. Okay. Unelected judges, right? Like states' rights. So we are heading back down that path. And, you could say the pendulum swings and this and that, but I do think that the 14th Amendment aside from freedom of religion and the First Amendment and those principles there, the First and 14th Amendments are the most Christian principles that we can identify. I mean, there are others that are important, but those are the most Christian. There was a document put out by an African-American, or a group of African-American lawyers in the late 1800s called the Brotherhood of Justice and Liberty, and they write about the 14th Amendment and its biblical roots, and it's fabulous. So that's part of the story here. I think it's really important to understand how slavery and racism weave into the abortion conversation, because Michelle Goodwin wrote a really good op-ed in the New York Times a few days ago about how the 13th Amendment, slavery, factors into the abortion discussion, because of course Black women had no reproductive rights, during the time of slavery. And so that has to be factored in. When there is no more slavery, then what does it mean to be forced into forced labor? Well, that's not just a pun. I mean, that was really part of the debate. It was debate, those amendments, the Reconstruction, excuse me, Reconstruction amendments were couched in both kind of classically male and female terms. So we have to revive that understanding. But the other thing is that the Constitution was made by the founders to be deliberately hard to change, right? Other constitutions in other countries, it is not as hard to change. So the way our system works, the way our democracy works, and by the way, our democracy is not the only way we can have a democracy, right? There's parliamentarian democracy, and we have representative democracy to our great detriment. I like to think of the United States as having the worst system out of the children of the old British Empire. Much rather have Canada's or Australia.
Okay.
But that's part of the narrative. That's part of what we have to understand, own, and to some degree work within, even as we try to change it. So that affects the abortion conversation, because that means, for at least for a while, different states are going to go in very different directions, and it's really hard. I mean, it is irrational, in my opinion, to say that women have equal rights in different states, that the fetus has equal rights in different states. And when we know there's going to be, kind of all these different directions that people are going in. So, I mean, that's part of the whole challenge.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up so many things that, again, I don't think we always think about, like even just thinking about the difficulty in amending the Constitution and how that plays into the way in which, I mean, the Roe decision from 1973, like, was a very interesting conglomeration of, let me pick 4 different amendments, I think, that this gives this right, based on also on precedent. I think Griswold v. Connecticut, the birth control case, it was, but it was an interesting way to do it, right? And then for a really long time, pro-life groups were trying to amend the Constitution to overturn Roe. And now people are talking about amending the Constitution the other way. And it's just not going to happen, right? Because, you kind of talked about it a little bit, but look at what happened with the ERA amendment. Like, that was universally, like, before some Christian women started campaigns against it, it was pretty much, yes, we should do this. It passed, almost through all of the states, and then just, a few short, and then decade after decade after decade. So yeah, I think amending the Constitution is just it's not really on the table. And I think it's an important thing that you bring up, that, like, that's intentional because of our founders' distrust of democracy, right? Like they wanted to give as few people as possible the right to vote, white male property owners. And so when we venerate the founders, I think the Constitution is a beautiful document. I think the birth of American democracy brought so many things that were previously not available to a portion of the population, and these high-minded philosophies, right? Some of which they didn't even, actually follow through with, of course. But it doesn't mean that it's perfect. And so I think that's where sometimes I stumble in conversations with people, because if you dare to question the way in which the Constitution is set up, the way in which it raises up some voters, and some votes count more than others, and just the way our system is set up, the Senate, the Electoral College, all that. Right. And I think that does, like you're saying, touch on the abortion issue. in terms of who gets to impose their view. For, I don't mean to say that sounds weighted, like I'm saying it's wrong, but who gets to decide
Right.
this in terms of voting? I think that's also connected. I think because you're doing such a great job of bringing all these things together, I think voting rights is connected to this too, right? Because when people don't have the same rights at the ballot, that their vote doesn't count in the same ways. And we won't get into all of that with, you know, the way the Senate is and representation and gerrymandering, but it's like, that's part of it too, right? So how do we, I don't know, how do we have like a holistic approach to this, right? Like, again, avoiding the teams, developing our own moral theological view of life. And then how do we translate that into this very flawed, still really good system? What does that look like? And I guess a prior question, and if you don't mind talking to this point, that I think is important, because I think it's also not a given that, you know, okay, so you arrive at this view of life and you think from your reading of church history in the Bible that like, this is when life begins, XYZ point. Does that necessarily translate into, therefore, I think this legislation should happen, or how do we address that issue?
That's a great question, and it's not simple, right? Because this is primarily rooted in Exodus 21 and how Christians are to read not just the Old Testament as a whole, but specifically things in the Sinai covenant, like in the Jewish law. It's one thing to look at creation to new creation and then to situate what we can from the Jewish law into that. Jesus does that with regards to marriage and divorce in Matthew 19, for instance. He says, you know, things about creation, new creation. Here's how understanding this middle period. With abortion, we just don't have, unfortunately, we don't have that luxury. So I could, you know, share a little bit about how the Jewish community has gone about it, how the Christian community has gone about it, and you'll get a sense for how complex it is. So the Jewish community camps out on the Hebrew Masoretic text, which they collected and standardized somewhere around the 9th century AD. And it's a good text. And that text says birth and breath constitute full legal personhood. And so the majority of the Jewish tradition goes with that and says abortion. It's never desirable. There are always health risks to the mother, and we treat it more as like self-harm. That's the way they read the passage in Exodus 21. It's about harming the mother, even though it's the fetus, and there's a miscarriage there. And so the state of Israel, you know, like has pretty what we would call liberal abortion laws. And not only that, the Jewish community has had to think about things like illegitimate or conception by adultery. And so, you know, there are passages in Numbers 5 and Deuteronomy 22 where it sure seems like even if a woman who's been in adultery is caught, then even if she's pregnant, it doesn't actually matter in the laws, right? And so and we can talk about what do we do with that, but essentially, well, see, there's an ordering, and the fetus is treated more as a part of the mother's body in the Jewish tradition. And you know, we can't say that they're arguing from bad faith, right? I mean, this is a text that we say things like, this is divinely inspired. So so, you know, and it's a First Amendment issue. Jesus said, like, well, you know, he brought people to himself voluntarily on the basis of their choice. And so, and also Paul in Romans 9-11 says, respect Judaism. So, you know, you put all these things together, and basically it's a First Amendment question now. Like, even if you are Christian and you hold to a stricter view than that, then how do you regard the Jewish community? Because this is still about their freedom of religion. There is that principle there too. And, you know, personally, I would say if even if our laws were to incentivize people to convert into Judaism, then I would actually be okay with that, because there's such a tremendous history of Gentile Christians mistreating Jewish people that I would err on that side. So, but then, I have to say, so for the Christian community, yeah, Basil of Caesarea was a doctor, and because of he actually took the Hippocratic Oath or something, or whatever that was at the time. But Hippocrates believed in instant formation, and in other words, the fetus was believed to be instantly formed and just kind of grew. And for centuries, the Greeks believed that the male sperm contributed the whole human being, and the woman contributed the nourishment.
Of course they did.
Right. And so,
of course they believed that.
Yeah. And so what Basil of Caesarea was trying to do, this is clear from other parts of his writings, when he's trying to develop a unified field of knowledge for theology, ethics, and science. And so, and he's trying to work with the idea that, okay, Jesus was conceived immaculately. So at what point did he in a fetal state look human? Well, it must have been all the way from the beginning. So because of this type of reasoning, you do have the Greek Orthodox saying we are never okay with abortion, which is fascinating, because that's not how the Catholic West understood it, right? Like they said, well, even with Jesus, there's this possibility that his body was being formed in the fetus, and then a human soul, God put a human soul into him. That's fine. Look at Adam, right? God made him and then breathed into him. It wasn't instantaneous, everything all at once. And presumably Eve was the same way, right? Unless we think that Eve was conscious from the moment God started shaping her body. I mean, why would God make her endure the formation of her own body like that? No way. And there's this pattern of God creates the physical structure and then invests the life. There's creation and then his image bearers. There's Adam and then there's the breath. There's the sanctuary and then there's the Shekinah glory. There's the temple and then there's the Shekinah glory. There's the community of the disciples and then Jesus breathes the Holy Spirit. There's biblically no problem with the idea of a delay between the physical formation and the investment of a human soul. And that would fit with both manuscripts of Exodus 21. So, I mean, the relevance there is to give, I think Christians can have a clear conscience voting for contraception, because a lot of contraception, of course, prevents the sperm from meeting the egg, but then some contraception can prevent the fertilized egg from implanting in the uterus. And so there are a lot of, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt and say that well-meaning legislators and lawmakers and citizens who believe I can't support contraception because it could cause abortion. And so, that's even true with intrauterine devices or copper IUDs, for instance, which are the most effective form of birth control that's long-lasting, long-acting. And it's been shown to be the best thing, especially for poor women who cannot get regular condoms, or maybe the men that they are with can't afford that either. So if that were available, it would dramatically reduce the number of unintended pregnancies. So that's an example of, okay, if I really want to stay as biblically grounded as possible, then I would make that connection. There is nothing that says that God ensouls the fetus from when the sperm meets the egg. And again, we could talk about the science behind that. Embryology also would indicate that. And we could revisit the Catholic view in 1869 when they said, well, there's a moral probability that could be the case. I would argue that we have to flip that. There's a moral improbability. In fact, there's an almost it's almost unequivocal. Like it can't actually, ensoulment cannot happen at day one, and there's reasons for that. So that's all in the book. We may or may not have time to get into it, but that is a part.
Yeah, again, I keep saying this, but I found that really helpful, the way you talked about that piece. Like you unpacked the biology of it so much, but just to pull out that point a little bit, because I'm someone who has that question, like, okay, I hear you saying, my body, my choice, and abortion's always, and government stay out of it, and all of those things. But my question becomes, what about those of us who understand that life begins in the womb somewhere? What do I do with that belief? How do I reconcile that to my desire for women to have autonomy when it, and then there seems to be this conflict. So I appreciate that conversation about the fertilized egg and the implantation. And I forget the stats, but you shared in there, was it like 70% of fertilized eggs don't implant just naturally, not to do with abortion?
One study from Stanford suggested that there are limitations with saying that. I would say between 50 to 70%, but those are all based on IVF study, in vitro fertilization studies, because no one cares to measure, well, how, and I'm not sure how we would do it anyway, right? Like in non-IVF settings, just a natural intercourse, how do we track those fertilized eggs that are being expelled and lost from the woman's body? Well, we don't really know, but 50 to 70%. And so that's another argument. It would be really weird if God were I don't know, or for God to lose 50 to 70% of all human beings just right from the jump.
Right from the start.
That raises a really big questions and weird questions. Like if any supervisor you had, for no reason at all, like set their teams, their people up to fail up to 50 to 70% of the time, that's bizarre. So that's just one thing. I mean, cell potency and the phenomenon of chimerism, of when twin cells actually recombine, which we know very little about, but some studies estimate that it happens to 30% of us, that you could be carrying the DNA of a twin. I mean, that poses a problem for Christian theology, because we have, if you say then that well, the soul, human beings can't have two souls, that's just theologically out of bounds. Right. We do observe other things like conjoined twins, even conjoined twins joined at the spine with two heads. I think we would say, well, that's complicated, but that's two souls, right? Those are two people. And so, but when there's a complete convergence, it gets dicey. And that's one of the reasons I would say, why don't we just take the early church as a lesson? Like, they looked at science, they looked at and they couldn't even agree about exactly which science was the more reliable, but they took it very seriously. It wasn't just scripture for them. So if we take them as role models, well, then what do we find? We find that probably we should push out the point of ensoulment until after all of the physical permutations like settle down. And that would be, I think, 23 days, but for different reasons, but that is well outside what IUDs would, when it would cause a expelling of the fertilized egg. Okay, yeah. And it's just so, it's another aspect that I think isn't often considered. I had a conversation recently with someone about what ensoulment is, and like, when is a person a person? And obviously that's at the heart of this question. So it seems strange to be like, I never just thinking about that. But the things you bring up are just, it's sort of like marrying that logic to the way in which, historically things have been looked at through the church. Like, okay, yeah, is every fertilized egg ensouled and then 50 to 70% of them die? It just doesn't seem logical. And again, it doesn't have to lead you to a specific conclusion, but like you said, it seems a little hard to get somewhere else, just logically, scientifically. Right. But it's interesting, the language you bring up about the Catholic Church and the change that they made in 1869, that moral probability. And it just made me think of like this idea of the ways in which
abortion and access to contraceptives, certain contraceptives that are considered abortive, who that falls on. And so I'm thinking about the moral probability of, like, as we consider this as Christians here and now, the moral probability of harm to specific sets of communities, right? I feel like that has to lead us somewhere, and maybe not the same place, again, not trying to be prescriptive about it, but to consider who this falls on, and who, I think we all know who will continue to have access to abortions is generally rich white people, who can travel, and that's the conversation going on right now. Like, states, that allow abortion pretty permissively, like heightening their availability, and then states that are already clamping down with the trigger laws, trying to even make that criminal, possibly, which brings up federalism again. And so as Christians, and we're running out of our time, but I think just introducing this idea of like thinking about the whole person, because again, not to like as a woman, but like as a woman, sometimes when this conversation happens, it's like, do you understand that women are people and not incubators? Like, we don't have this conversation about, just bring back that language, the moral probability of harm, whether it's that very medical stuff. I mean, I'm sure you've seen online, I'm sure we all have on social media, women sharing their stories about traumatic miscarriages, like terrible diagnosis, for being unable to carry to term, and either having access to healthcare or not, and then what that looks like going forward. So thinking about who are we don't have to exclusively just advocate for one set of people, I guess, is where I'm thinking about that. That's right. So how do we reconcile that? And what do we advocate for? I mean, I think some of those things are really self-evident, right? We should have better healthcare, anti-poverty stuff, as we're talking about, but is there stuff specifically that you're thinking of now, that like, this is where we need to be looking as a Christian community?
I don't have one position on abortion. It's very difficult. I have a bunch of, probably like you, values and contingencies. So, but if I looked at Roe v. Wade, then aside from the basis for it, which I did feel like, the basis could have been better, but the outcome and the structure was a lot like quickening. It was close to it, and the dissenting judges in Dobbs actually say that and all that decision did was to set up a framework for when a woman takes priority, when the fetus takes priority, and when the each individual state can kind of decide and navigate and negotiate that. So, and that was the basis for their trimester system. It was an attempt at federalism. And, it was because they looked at also when the state laws actually went all over the place, before Roe v. Wade on abortion. So they had to ask, well, at what point did we have a national law on abortion or about it? Well, we never did. So what was the common law? If you can't look at statutes or statutory law, well, and then you get to English common law, and that was driven by the Anglican understanding and the Latin West understanding of quickening. So that's fair. Was it spelled out as well as it needed to be? No, but so just because there is legal precedent now in Roe, and maybe it needs to be re-explored, some of that foundation, I would personally be okay with reestablishing it. I know that's not everyone's position, but it gave room for different things, like a woman's disability or a woman's health during pregnancy. When could she get an abortion with her doctor? Because you really don't want to force women into a gray market or black market situation. That's just really potentially lethal, and it falls disproportionately on, the cost of it falls on poor women, women of color, and not connected women. And so, as you said, that we know that anti-abortion laws prior to Roe v. Wade stopped abortion like prohibition stopped alcohol. It really didn't, especially the wealthier and the more connected you were. And it just pushed it into different places. And it actually corrupted both, especially law enforcement, and the medical profession kind of had their hands tied. So, you know, there are important questions that I think are hard to answer, because a pregnant woman and the fetus are a dyad, and Enlightenment philosophy and law is individualistic. And so abortion sits at the reality of relational forms of justice, right? And you have to take some kind of harm reduction approach and restorative approach to all these things. And it's not simple. And if we had more time, maybe we could explore that. But I would say that's part of the acknowledgement that we need to make.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I think you touched on a few other points. We'll have that be like a teaser, because that's stuff you address in your book. Specifically that the prohibition comparison, I again found that very compelling. I feel like that's just a refrain that I'm doing now, but like, I just found that compelling to think about, people always talk about if Roe gets overturned, we're back to back alley abortions. And it's almost like this like movie thing, but thinking about, okay, we have a time in history that happened. What did that look like? And so to think about who still had access, who didn't have access,
right,
who ended up with children or in poverty, or, had a medical problems that either led to disability or death, and all of these different things that happen. And also that other side, like you're saying, the medical community and what that does with law enforcement. Like, is this going to be applied, across the board evenly? No, because no laws are. So again, who does the harm fall on? So I think that that's also one of the nuances that we need to examine. And again, I think people can land in different places. My hope is that we still travel down the road, though. We don't just go to the place where we're told this is our view one way or the other, not trying to two sides it, but that we look at all of these things.
Yep.
And again, especially think about, what does this mean? How can we pursue the flourishing of everyone? And what does that look like?
Right.
It's not so cut and dry.
That's right. We have to care about the implementation of laws, because there's going to be a lot of unintended consequences for this. But it'd be really sad if it was intentionally caused. I mean, there are probably a few people who would want to see that kind of stuff happen, and I think that's terrible. But the other paradigm is, from a societal level, is capitalism so brutal and dehumanizing that actually having sexual intimacy and even having a kid as a single parent, are those things some of the most humanizing things that people can do? If so, right, what I'm saying is suggesting, and I didn't quite say it this way in the book, but I think it's worth reflecting on, because I do wonder about it. I'm maybe close to saying it like this, but like, what if sex is a constant in society, and all we can do is to shape the policies around it so that marriage is more attractive and healthy child, like a pronatal approach, is more attractive? Like, what if that's what we can do? What if having retributive policies, especially about people's sex lives, is counterproductive and produces cycles of poverty and cycles of just harm that are awful? That, I think, is something that would be a real shift. Now, I am a Christian, and I do hope people could actually make better choices, right? But that's on an individual level. But even with that, I feel like it takes pastoral care, it takes discipleship, it takes a community to go in that direction. Like, do I think that evangelicalism in America is providing that? No, I don't. So what am I more likely to believe on a social level? I'm more likely to believe that sex is just a constant. And gosh darn it, if we can encourage people to get married as they do so, then that's better. And that has to do with, as I mentioned before, jobs in certain areas, it has to do with a lot of things. And so it's not a one issue thing. It's very holistic.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate that. And I feel like that's a good place to kind of leave it, this idea that it's holistic, right? That the way we approach it theologically and politically and practically, it needs to be holistic. We need to consider all of it. And again, we can end up in different places, but we need to faithfully consider all of it together, how it interacts, the intersectionality of all of that. So yeah, for sure. Okay, well, I am gonna let you go and we're gonna post this, but I just really appreciate you taking the time, and I really, really appreciate your book and the way in which you help us walk through this as believers to just consider it more carefully, which I think is just so important. And especially now in the moment that we're in, I think it's really important for Christians to be able to talk about these things, as uncomfortable as they are, and to have a nuanced and really foundational understanding of our history and the practical implications of the things we advocate for. I think it's irresponsible and not Christ-like to just go forward with a policy and not understand the ways in which it's going to affect real people. So yeah,
right.
So thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And I hope any listeners of this would feel free to reach out, connect with me. I'm hosting 3 1-hour sessions on Saturdays, July 9th, 16th, and 23rd, likely at 9 a.m. Eastern time for 1 hour each on Zoom. And so reach out to me for information about it.
Yeah, we could definitely share the link for that. If you have, is it on your website?
Yes, it's on my website, and I'll give you the graphic.
Yeah, we'll share that because that sounds like an amazing opportunity. So thank you for always so freely sharing your knowledge and your experience and your passions for this stuff. And thank you for everyone who's joining at various and sundry times in the future. And we'll continue to have these conversations about different things. We hope next month or August to bring a conversation around gun violence and the ways in which Christians in particular are advocating around that issue and how we can engage and learn. So look out for that on our social media and our website. Thank you so much, Mako. As always, it's so good to talk to you.
Likewise, Elizabeth. Have a great night.
All right, you too.